Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is ours. So you've been in India for almost 5 days this time around. For starters, how has your visit been so far? And how is IFAD collaborating with the Government of India for G20?
So it's been a really exciting visit. Clearly, there's a lot of excitement about India's presidency of G20, and you cannot but see it and feel it while you're here. But it's been a really interesting visit because I got the opportunity to go and visit an IFAD-supported project that the government has been running in Odisha for a number of years and really see our work supporting the government on the ground, and that was fascinating. The kind of two insights I took away from that. The first one was it's targeting the most vulnerable tribal groups. And the government has so many programs supporting the poor, the rural poor, helping people. And what the project is doing is making sure that those programs really reach the particularly vulnerable groups and make that bridge and connection. And, and that was really interesting. The second thing is we've been supporting it for a long time, and national government were interested enough and heard enough about it. They actually sent a senior delegation to look at it. And on the back of that, they've now announced they're going to scale it up nationally. And just recently in the budget announcements have put in a big new program on it. So that's a really good example of where, an organization like IFAD can help government work through some of these issues and then take them to scale. In terms of the G20 presidency, which is so exciting, it's so exciting having a country like India being president because you have so many important, relevant experiences, and for an organization like IFAD that focuses on the rural poor, India has got such leadership on poverty elimination, improving of incomes. In that context, we've been supporting the working group. There's a track on agriculture, sustainable agriculture. We've been particularly working at that. And our support has been about inclusion. Is ensuring that everyone benefits from agriculture, because many small farmers, many rural communities, their livelihoods are based on agriculture. Sometimes we forget that. We think big, we think commercial. But over 50% of the world's protein comes from small farmers. Over 30% of the world's food comes from small farmers. You can't have food security, you can't have sustainable food systems without small farmers. So we've been working with the presidency to ensure it works for small farmers in that context.
Interesting. And India's G20 presidency focuses on the welfare of small farmers particularly. We've seen it in the first G20 Agriculture Working Group meeting as well. Having said that, let's broad base this and look at the overall challenges that the world is facing in light of the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the geopolitical tensions. Conflict and food insecurity go hand in hand. World hunger has been rising since 2018.
Yep.
What is IFAD doing about it? I understand that there's a crisis response initiative that you have come up with. What is the kind of impact that it's having?
So IFAD's mission is to help the rural poor. We say we get to the last mile, to the places most formal services don't reach. So we've always focused on food security, and we've focused on building the resilience and the incomes of poor people. So yes, we've had two big crises, the pandemic, the global geotensions, but we mustn't forget climate change in there. Climate change isn't going away. We see extreme weather events getting more and more and more. The people that suffer most from this are the poor, and often the rural poor. So the most important thing when you're looking at the rural poor, when you're looking at agriculture, is on adaptation and strengthening the ability of small farmers to adapt to climate change in their agriculture. And that's something we very much focus on. So that's our long-term work. In the short term, in responding to crisis, it's trying to build up small farmers, rural producers' ability to cope with shocks, whether it's pandemics, whether it's geopolitical tensions, whether it's extreme weather events. So we do a lot of that in our projects, but specifically for the pandemic, we had something called the Rural Poor Stimulus Facility, which was a nearly $100 million fund to just provide some immediate response to to the pandemic, the sort of things small farmers wanted was access to inputs, was access to credit, because very often small farmers rely on credit, seasonal credit, rather than, and banks won't give it, so they need credit or they can't buy the seeds to plant. Access to technology, and particularly digital, because if we remember the pandemic, movement was restricted, etc. They could get no information on prices in markets, no information on where to sell their crops. So digital was very important. So we had a very successful, we helped over 20 million people with that, as well as, our normal projects. And then for the geopolitical tensions, we launched something called the Crisis Response Initiative, learning from our first intervention. This was even more focused. It was not looking at the geopolitical issue. We were focused on what we called, basically polycrisis, compound crisis, because some of the poorest countries are suffering from drought. You look at the Horn of Africa, suffering from drought, suffering from the geopolitical impacts, lack of access to grains, fertilizer, and suffering from the pandemic. And that we've launched, and that's proving very popular, and we're running that through our projects.
Mm-hmm. So are you looking at cooperation within the framework of the G20 and members of the Global South? Because India is saying it wants to be a voice of the Global South, and several of these small farmers are in rural communities in developing countries.
Very much. For us it is about the Global South. The interesting thing, or the real opportunity in the G20, was food security and agriculture was not a major issue in the G20. The geopolitical crisis, and up to a point the famine in the Horn of Africa and so on, has really focused minds on food security, food systems. So it's a real opportunity to make this a central point, which is what the Indian presidency has done. So suddenly many parts of the world, particularly the global north, who was not interested in discussing this, the impact of the global political crisis has affected my own country, the United Kingdom, the US, so they're very interested in it. So we need to grasp that opportunity, and we need to ensure, as I say, that small farmers, poor rural producers are part of that conversation. So it's a real opportunity.
We can further build on the point of the climate smart agriculture, but before that, amid the poly crisis, as your teams work on ground, there's a lot of field work you do in India as well. What are the challenges that they face? India is actually a really strong partner for us. It's kind of interesting. The reason I hesitate, I'm trying to think of what the challenges are. I think the challenges are more not about us, but that India faces, because we don't have EFAD projects, we have government projects that EFAD support. The challenges are about ensuring that India does very good things at scale, but you will have, like the marginal groups, like the tribal groups, like the backward populations, sometimes they are not the ones that can get access to these large programs at scale. So the challenges we face, or what the challenges we try and help solve, is how do you ensure everyone benefits, not just the majority? And that's probably the biggest thing. And then the second thing is clearly, our work is at state level generally in India, and you have a whole range of states, some with very strong capacity, some very sort of advanced, some less so. We tend to work in the states that are the most needy, and that always produces some challenges about capacity, about institutional capacity as you're working, but that's part of the reason, we're there to support the government. EFAD has been working with India for a long time. You personally have had a long association with India. You've spoken about the challenges. What are the opportunities that you see, and do you sense some sort of a transformation over the decades in India? Do you think that things have improved going forward?
I think it's like night and day. I first started coming to India in 1999. I've been coming regularly since then. When I look at what I saw in 1999 and now, it's not even just like a different country, it's like a different universe. India is changing so quickly, so positively. the great thing for us in partnering somewhere like India is we can, it's not the financing we bring. India has more than enough of its own financing. It's a little bit about some of the technical expertise we have. We're a global organization. We tackle similar issues, be it tribal communities, be it poor farmers across the world. So we can harvest knowledge from South America, from other countries in Asia, from Africa, from the Pacific, from the Near East, etc., and bring that to bear on some of the issues in India. But equally, we can take many of the innovations and things in India and take them back to other countries. So South-South cooperation is a major issue. And India has so much to offer in that side as well as receive, and and that's something we can play a role in.
So during the pandemic, we saw that India provided free food grains to over 80 crore of its citizens over 28 months. In the last union budget, we've seen that scheme being extended by another 1 year. So this was during the COVID-19 pandemic and continues in the post-pandemic period because of the aftermath of the pandemic. How do you look at the way India catered to food security of its own citizens and also some of the members of the Global South? We've been exporting wheat and other food grains during the pandemic to them in exceptional circumstances.
I think India did extremely well. I mean, you see, we haven't had real problems with food security in India over the period. I think IFAD's worked closely with the government on that. Since you asked me the question, I would just like to say there's a brochure that talks all about support in the pandemic times and IFAD support within that context. I think you have done very well. I think that, and it's important that it doesn't stop too quickly, because as the pandemic, it hasn't ended, but as it's gone down, we've been hit by the geopolitical tensions, which in some ways has had even more impact than COVID did on food security. So it's really important you don't end too quickly. I think the challenge is, though, it does have to finish. So then the question is, how do you transition out? And that's something which government is thinking about and needs to think about now, because it's very easy for these systems to almost become ingrained. And actually, for a country like India, with the potential you've got, what you really need to is create the space for the producers, the private sector, to fill it in. And I have every confidence, given the transformation you're already doing here, to do that. So I think you've had a great thing, but now we need to look at how we transition out.
Now, climate smart agriculture has a number of sub-layers. You were talking earlier about it. In the context of G20, we saw in the first meeting of the Agriculture Working Group meeting that there was focus on how climate finance can help farmers, particularly when it comes to adaptation funding or incentivizing green farming through carbon credits, etc. What do you think about it, and do you see some sort of a partnership between IFAD and G20 on this?
Very much so. I mean, it's interesting we talk about climate smart agriculture. I always sort of think, why do we even say that? You would not be very smart if you weren't doing climate smart agriculture. It should be the norm. Given climate change, there is nothing that's not climate smart or it won't survive. So it's just common sense. Just like when people talk about, climate change. You can't do development really without thinking about climate change anymore. Good development means adapting to climate change. IFAD's had for 13 years now, it's had something called the Adaptation Smallholder Agriculture Program. It is the largest global program for smallholder adaptation. So we've had about 13 years of experience of doing that. So we feel we can bring that knowledge and understanding to the G20 to share our experiences, having worked on this area for 13 years. I think it's a really important issue for the G20, as we saw at COP 27, 26. The interest in climate finance has been mainly focused on mitigation. I think it's something like only 3% of climate finance has gone to adaptation. And mitigation clearly is very important, but if we can't produce food in a world of climate change, it doesn't really matter what you do in mitigation, the world won't survive. So really getting much more focus on adaptation and get the finance flowing to it, to me, is such a key priority. And particularly in countries like India, where so many of your farmers, I mean, you produce, you know, in 2000 when I came here, India imported quite a lot of food. You know, you're the biggest exporter in the world now of many crops and things, but it's all got to be climate smart, and that comes often from small producers aggregated up. So really getting that focus on adaptation, making sure the finance flows. We've got to get away. It shouldn't be 3%, it should be 50%, you know, or the world has a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, climate smart agriculture is what is sustainable agriculture, and India has been pulling out a lot of stops when it comes to pursuing sustainable agriculture. India is focusing a lot on natural farming, on organic farming. It's giving soil health cards to its farmers. It's focusing on micro irrigation. Also, digitization of agriculture is helping a lot of farmers. As an agri stack for agriculture that the government of India has come out with. How do you look at this approach of the government towards sustainable agriculture?
So I think the government's got an extremely good and enlightened approach to it. I think there's 2 or 3 things I would say. Again, going back to this approach, we need to ensure that it's also appropriate for the very small farmers and some of the more remote ones. When I travel the world, I hear a lot about sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture. Quite often it's based on quite high technology solutions. You know, take your example of digital. India leads the world on digital. The challenge for us is to make sure that the poor farmer can access that digital and it's appropriate for it. So for example, when I was in Odisha recently, if you went to the village we visited 5 years ago, there was no connectivity to the village. Physically, there, you couldn't pick up a mobile network. Now you can. So now you can do that. And that, I think, is the real challenge for some of these solutions, is making sure they're really accessible to them. And also to make sure the incentives right. We talk about sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture. I think India's done a lot of work looking at soil health, looking at the fact that we cannot have a world that's reliant on inorganic fertilizers. But sometimes you see in countries, when you're down at the roots, there's still a strong incentive to sell inorganic fertilizers, to sell pesticides and herbicides. So we need to make sure that we get the incentives right alongside it.
Building on that, I was thinking about how millets are also smart crops. They are the future crop. They are good for all stakeholders, consumers, farmers, as well as the climate. India is popularizing millets through G20 meetings. The various cuisines have millets as an essential component for the G20 guests here. What do you think about India's leadership? Because India also was a very strong voice in favor of having 2023 as the International Year of Millets. And how can IFAD and G20 under India's presidency take this initiative forward? There's a G20 initiative on millets that India has proposed.
So I would just like to say I love it. Very simply, you know, things like millet are so important when we look at climate change, but also on nutrition. We've got into a very monoculture world where things like maize, wheat have become the staples. We've forgotten crops like millet, like sorghum, and some of these other crops that are much better suited to climate change. So the fact that someone like India and through the G20 presidency is really highlighting something like millet is absolutely fantastic. And we need to really get behind India's leadership on this, because it's so important. And you know, millet used to be grown in many countries, and it's been lost. So we need to do a lot of fundamental research, rediscovering the varieties, looking at some of the better high yielding ones, and India's well placed to lead on that. I mean, not only is your national research, agricultural research systems very strong, you're also the home of ICRISAT, which is the world centre for things like millet. There's not been much investment in it, in the research, and India can lead on that. My only little thing, which I sort of say half jokingly, is if I had one wish for India's presidency and push on millets, is I would call it millets and sorghum, because sorghum is very closely related to millets. in Africa, which has such problems of food security, they have millets, but they also have a lot more sorghum. And sorghum and millets are almost the same. Mm-hmm. So, you know, to make it even more exciting, we could go for millets in brackets sorghum. So it also reaches out to Africa as well, because really it's one and the same. And India has a lot of experience on varieties and sorghum too.
Continuing on the lighter vein that you referred to, have you been trying millets and sorghum?
Yeah, you can't get away from it. With the presidency and the leadership of the government here, I think every snack I was offered in a disher has been millets, nothing else. And fantastic recipes, fantastic sort of snacks. So yeah, I used to, you know, eat quite a lot of millet when I was living in Africa and otherwise. You've taken it to another level. In fact, I'm taking back some millet snacks to my family in Rome because they were so delicious.
I'm sure they'll love it all. Now, since you've referred to Odisha quite a few times, and there's so much of field work that IFAD does in India and in developing countries, tell us about some success stories within India and broadly speaking in the global south.
So as I said at the beginning, I thought the work in Odisha was a real success story. And what was so successful? One, development is long term. So you need to look at a partnership, and IFAD's been in India for over 40 years. You know, one of IFAD's strengths is we've been long-term in countries, and we build on what we've learned before. So, you know, you could see in addition the investments we've had in livelihoods programs in India for over 30 years is really starting to pay off in learning the lessons and taking it through. And as I say, for me, the real success is that someone like IFAD does not have very good projects that are not scalable. And so the real success is where they're scalable. So when I see government taking on those lessons and launching a whole program on supporting tribal vulnerable groups based on some of the learnings we've had with the governments, that to me is a real success story. We've done a lot of work on adaptation, and when I look at kind of climate smart agriculture in many countries, I think we should be proud of what we've managed to do. I think another area which I think has been a success for IFAD, as I was saying earlier, is the fact that we do operate in all different contexts, environmental, climatic, political, etc. So what we have is a wealth of experience. The one thing I've learned in nearly 40 years of development is every context is different, but some of the concepts are the same, and you need to take that concept to the different context and adapt it, and that's where I think we've had some success. But overall, you know, you're looking for some of those stories, even in some of the hardest environments, we've managed to have a real impact. I mean, just as I said on our response to COVID, that in the space of a year we could have identifiable evidence-based improvements in people's livelihoods for 20 million people. You know, that makes me very proud. You've got to have results at scale. The challenges on hunger and other issues are so large, and if we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, it's all very well having nice boutique projects, but it's got to be scalable. Sometimes we have to look at maybe not having the perfect, but having the good that can be at scale, and I'm proud of that from IFAD's perspective.
What is the status of Ukraine as a member of IFAD, and what does IFAD plan to do for Ukraine going forward?
Clearly you have been doing your homework. We had a governing council meeting last week, the week before, in February, at which Ukraine was approved as a new member of IFAD. So Ukraine will be a new member of IFAD. So we are now looking at how we can support Ukraine. I mean, everyone thinks about Ukraine as large farms producing, and that's the image many people have in their mind. Actually, Ukraine, the majority of farmers in Ukraine are small farmers. That's what IFAD's expertise is in. We've also got experience not only from the region that's relevant in the type of farming you would have in Ukraine, whether it's in Moldova, Georgia, Uzbekistan. So we can bring experience from that sort of farming system. But also we've got a lot of experience in conflict and post-conflict countries, Yemen, Somalia, many of these countries. So I think we have experiences we can bring to bear in Ukraine. we need to partner with many other agencies and find our niche. But I think we do have something to offer at the moment. Now they have become a member. We're working to do some assessments and plan and see how we can support them within the international community.
Towards the end, to distill this conversation, what are the priority areas that you see for IFAD for the G20 particularly?
IFAD for the G20, I think there's two areas. One is around the agriculture track, and we've talked quite a lot about that. The other one is around the finance track. We've touched on it, but the biggest issue, if we're serious about food systems transformation, sustainable agriculture, food security, is ensuring we've got the finance there. Otherwise it's words. And the finance comes from a number, obviously, organizations like IFAD have a role to play, but other development banks, the World Bank, etc. Governments themselves have a major responsibility, and we see that with India. And the third area, which to me is the real win, is the private sector. In many ways we've tended to talk about public finance too much, but actually the real finance has to come from private sector. So how do we, coming out of the G20, really make sure we get a strong partnership, public and private? And I'll leave you with one thought. In IFAD, you hear a lot about the 3 Ps, public-private partnerships. In IFAD, we always talk about the 4 Ps, public-private producer partnerships. And it's that producer P that I want to see come out of this too.
Pleasure, Mr. Brown. Thank you for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
मिठाई तो हमारे जमाने में होती थी।
हाँ तो जाइए ना अपने जमाने में।
रोमांस तो हमारे जमाने में होता था।
पेमेंट भी उसी जमाने का है। अरे भैया डिजिटल पेमेंट करना सीखे नए जमाने। इजी, सेफ एंड फास्ट है। हमने तो इनको डिजिटल पेमेंट